Grey light seeped through the narrow windows of Ironwood State Prison, casting a ghostly pallor on the concrete walls, as if even the sun recoiled from what was about to unfold. The corridors echoed with the metronomic stomp of guards' boots, a mechanical rhythm against the cold, dull blue of institutional paint. In the secure wing, Dwayne Johnson, 53 years old, lay shackled to a steel-frame bed, the chains at his wrists and ankles as much a part of him now as the weary lines carved into his face. He hadn't slept more than a handful of hours in the past week. Each time he closed his eyes, the looming image of the execution room crept into his dreams. And now, with the sun crawling above the horizon, the countdown was real. In just a few hours, he would be transferred to the final holding cell adjacent to the death chamber. 2 hours after that, a lethal injection would carry out what the state had sentenced 5 years ago. No family had come, no last-minute clemency. Only Reverend Morris, the prison chaplain, had visited him in recent weeks, offering prayers, quiet conversation, and a semblance of humanity. Yet, Dwayne clung to a final wish, one tethered not to redemption or justice, but to love. "I want to see Eclipse before I die," he whispered once again to the guard posted outside his cell. The guard didn't answer, didn't flinch. Eclipse wasn't just a dog. He was Dwayne's sole companion, a German shepherd adopted from a shelter 3 years before the arrest. To Dwayne, Eclipse was more than a pet. He was family, he was hope. Warden Mara Batista appeared at the cell window. Her voice, measured and official, cut through the silence. "Johnson, final requests are subject to protocol. Bringing an animal onto prison grounds is unprecedented. We don't even know where the dog is." Dwayne's voice cracked as he answered. "Helen Griggs, my fiancée before all this. Eclipse is with her, or he was." His tone attempted calm, but his eyes betrayed a longing so deep it bordered on desperation. "Please, Warden, if there's any mercy left in this place, let me see my dog." Batista hesitated, the bureaucrat giving way momentarily to the human. "I'll see what I can do," she said, softer now. "But don't get your hopes up." Dwayne didn't. He was too used to disappointment, too familiar with the slow erosion of hope. But even in this final stretch, he harbored one last ember of defiance, the refusal to believe he had murdered anyone. For half a decade, Dwayne had declared his innocence to anyone who would listen. He'd lost count of the appeals. He'd lost faith in the courts, maybe even in God, but not in the truth. Outside the cell, a muffled conversation floated in from a hallway. Another protest had formed beyond the prison fences. "Half of them think he's guilty as hell," a guard said. "The other half just want to abolish the death penalty." Dwayne closed his eyes, letting the voices fade into white noise. None of it mattered now. Not the slogans, not the chants, not the outrage. The state would follow through with its sentence. It always did. He rose from the bed, chains clinking with every movement. Shuffling toward the slit of a window, he stared at the pinkish streaks of dawn brushing the horizon. It reminded him of the mornings he once spent walking Eclipse through Redwood City's quiet streets, the leash taut, Eclipse darting with joy. In those early moments, the world had felt simple, safe. Strangers would smile at the duo. Some even asked, "Did you train him yourself?" Dwayne, proud and beaming, would always answer, "Yeah." Eclipse was a marvel, clever, loyal, eager to please. Not just a dog, a lifeline. The cell door rattled. A guard stood at the threshold, eyes averted. "Johnson, time to go. We're moving you to the final holding cell. The warden wants you prepped." Dwayne stared at him. "Am I getting my last wish?" The guard hesitated, then muttered, "They're checking with the Department of Corrections. Don't hold your breath." Nodding, Dwayne turned and extended his wrists. The cuffs snapped shut with a practiced click. As the door shut behind him, he cast one final glance at the narrow slit of daylight. It was barely there, but maybe, Just maybe, this wouldn't be his last sunrise, and if it was, he hoped he'd see Eclipse first. Inside the cold, sterile walls of the prison, time moved like syrup, thick and suffocating. As Dwayne Johnson was escorted down a series of dim corridors to the final holding cell, every step echoed like a countdown clock ticking off the seconds to his execution. The fluorescent lights above flickered now and then, their sterile buzz, underscoring the quiet dread that clung to the air. Dwayne didn't speak. The guards didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said over the years of trials, appeals, and procedural dead ends. The final cell was no different than the others, just whiter, quieter, and far more final. The door clicked shut behind him. A lone camera above the door lens blinked its red eye. Surveillance, even in his last hours. Dwayne sat on the edge of the narrow bunk, elbows resting on his knees, the paper bag containing his last meal untouched on the floor. He didn't request anything fancy, just a cheeseburger with extra pickles and a soda. The request had nothing to do with hunger. It was nostalgia, a memory he clung to, a relic of a simpler time, the day he and Helen adopted Eclipse from the shelter. They had shared a burger, just like it on a park bench, Eclipse still a nervous, uncertain pup, nibbling fries from his palm. That day, life felt full of promise. That promise now sat in a paper bag, soggy and irrelevant. The small of his back ached. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he had carried silently. He took a sip of the soda and then set it aside, staring at the wall as if he could see through it and back into a life he barely recognized anymore. Dwayne had always believed that the truth would rise, that innocence, like oil, would float to the top of any investigation if only someone looked hard enough. But it didn't, not this time. The state wanted someone to blame. The system wanted closure. And Dwayne had fit the narrative too perfectly. A man with military training, found near the crime scene, accused of holding a grudge over a soured business deal. The prosecution painted a picture that made jurors uncomfortable. That was enough. But Dwayne remembered everything. He remembered the night of the murder, how the rain had soaked his clothes, how the red and blue lights flashed against wet pavement when the police surrounded him, how one of the officers sneered, "We got our guy," he had said then, and every day after, that he didn't do it, that he didn't kill Raymond Kincaid, that the money transfer flagged in his bank account was never his doing, that the fingerprint on the knife was circumstantial. It was a knife he once owned, stolen from his truck weeks before. No one listened, or if they did, they didn't believe. They had Raymond Kincaid, a wealthy real estate tycoon, dead in his penthouse, and they had Dwayne, poor and black, found 3 blocks away in a neighborhood that didn't welcome his kind. What more did they need? The door rattled again. Officer Garcia stepped in cautiously. She didn't wear the cold detachment of most guards. Her eyes, though trained to be professional, betrayed discomfort. She slid the last meal a little closer. 30 minutes, she said. If the warden gives the go-ahead, they'll bring the dog. Her voice caught slightly at the end, as if she were struggling to reconcile the word dog with what it meant to the man in front of her. Dwayne nodded. Slowly. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. She left without another word. He leaned back, head against the wall, mind spinning. Eclipse. Would the dog even recognize him after 5 years? Would he bark in confusion or joy? Would the prison environment scare him? Dwayne didn't know, but he needed to see him, needed to touch something pure, something that hadn't been poisoned by the courts, the media, or the public opinion. He closed his eyes and breathed in. The air was sterile, scrubbed down with bleach and resignation. Yet in his mind, he was walking the Redwood Creek path again, Eclipse bounding ahead, tail wagging like a banner of freedom. Outside the walls of Ironwood, the storm was rising. Protesters were gathering. Some held signs demanding justice for Raymond Kincaid. Others shouted for the abolition of the death penalty. Neither side knew the full truth, Not yet. Not about Walton Green. Not about the missing forensic evidence. Not about the hidden history of Kincaid himself. And in a modest townhouse across the city, Helen Griggs hadn't slept. She had been pacing the floors since midnight. Eclipse lying on his dog bed, ears twitching with every creak of the floorboards. The moment she saw the morning news flash that Dwayne's execution was set for 9 a.m., something inside her cracked. She had tried everything, letters to journalists, interviews with podcasters, even a long-shot plea to the new district attorney. Nothing worked, but now the warden had called. "Miss Griggs," Batista had said, "Dwayne's final request is to see Eclipse. If you have him, we need you both here within 90 minutes. Helen had stared at the phone as if it were some divine test. Eclipse, as if understanding, rose from his bed, his silver-flecked coat shimmering under the weak morning light. She clipped on his leash, threw on a coat, and within minutes they were in her truck, barreling down the highway. The city was still. Waking up, traffic was light, the sky blushing with the first traces of dawn, but every tick of the clock was a blade at her throat. She didn't care that she looked frantic. She didn't care that her phone kept buzzing with friends, asking if she'd heard the news. All she cared about was getting Dwayne his final wish. She had been there from the beginning, when he first held Eclipse at the shelter, when they picked out a name, when they moved into their apartment and talked about a wedding that never came. Helen believed in his innocence. The evidence had always seemed flimsy, a partial fingerprint, circumstantial, motive, unreliable witnesses. But the narrative was compelling, and the prosecution delivered it with theatrical precision. Now, as she passed the barbed wire fences of Ironwood, a correctional officer stepped into the road. She rolled down the window, voice trembling. "I'm here for Dwayne Johnson. I have his dog, Eclipse." The officer checked a clipboard and waved her through. It was happening, the final moment. Whether for goodbye or redemption, Helen didn't know. But she whispered under her breath, "Hold on, Dwayne. Just hold on a little longer." Back in the holding cell, Dwayne sat perfectly still. Outside, he could hear footsteps again, the shuffle of a large body, the click of claws on tile, and then something else, a soft, familiar whine. His breath caught. He stood, chains rattling as he moved closer to the door. The bolt slid, the handle turned, and for the first time in 5 years he saw her. Helen, eyes red, clutching Eclipse's leash. The dog froze, ears pricking up, tail twitching. And then an explosion of motion. Eclipse surged forward, tail whipping, barking a familiar joyous bark that cracked Dwayne's heart wide open. But that's a moment for the next part of the story. For now, all that mattered was hope. Hope that had survived against all odds. Helen stood motionless for a second in the doorway, barely able to breathe. The sight of Dwayne, shackled, thinner, but unmistakably him, sliced through her heart with both pain and relief. Eclipse, however, knew no such hesitation. The German shepherd launched himself forward, dragging the leash from Helen's fingers, nails scraping against the tile, as he bounded toward Dwayne with a cry that was half bark, half joyful sob. Dwayne dropped to his knees before the dog even, reached him, arms outstretched like a man reaching for salvation. The chains tugged, limiting his movement, but Eclipse didn't care. He pushed his massive head into Dwayne's chest, licking his face with frantic affection. Dwayne let out a choked laugh, tears streaking down his cheeks. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, voice breaking. "Hey, I missed you so much." Helen stood just inside the room, trembling. She could barely see through the haze of tears. Dwayne looked up, eyes locking with hers, and for a second the years melted away. "Helen," he said softly. No apology, no explanation, just her name, and it was enough. She nodded and stepped closer, sinking down beside Eclipse. The dog was now pressed between them, tail still wagging, breathing hard like he'd run a marathon. She reached out, touched Dwayne's hand. He grabbed it with both of his, squeezing like he was afraid it might vanish. "I tried," she whispered. I tried everything, the DA, reporters, appeals. Nobody would listen. I know, he replied. You did more than anyone. Just seeing you here, seeing him, it means everything. Warden Batista stood at the door, her normally rigid posture softened. 15 minutes, she said gently, then the chaplain will arrive. Dwayne nodded, unable to look away from Helen or Eclipse. She glanced down at the dog. He never forgot you. He sleeps beside the door some nights. He still waits. Dwayne leaned into Eclipse's fur, inhaling deeply as though trying to memorize the scent. The dog whimpered, pawing at his arms, licking the tears from his face. Helen sat quietly for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of Dwayne's jumpsuit. You still have that dimple, she said suddenly. He smiled faintly. And you still scrunch your nose when you're about to cry, he replied. A laugh broke through the silence, light but real. For the first time in years, something felt right. Batista cleared her throat again. Do you want Eclipse to stay until the chaplain arrives? She asked. Dwayne looked up, startled. I would be grateful, ma'am. Then he can stay, Batista said, turning to the hallway. Helen pressed her forehead to Dwayne's. I'll wait outside, she murmured. I'll be right there. He nodded. She gave Eclipse one last scratch behind the ears and stood up, her legs wobbling beneath her. As she exited, the door clanged shut behind her. Dwayne and Eclipse were alone. For a few stolen moments, the outside world ceased to exist. There was no death chamber, no ticking clock, no verdict. There was only a man and his dog. Dwayne stroked behind Eclipse's ears, whispering little things, old commands, shared memories. Remember the creek, he said. Remember the ducks? You always tried to chase them. Eclipse gave a soft woof as if in answer. Dwayne's hands trembled as he clutched the thick ruff of fur. You saved me, he whispered. Every day I thought about you. Every time I wanted to give up, I remembered your face, your loyalty. I held on for you. Footsteps again. A knock. Then the door opened and the chaplain entered quietly. Dwayne blinked, returning to the present. The guard reached for Eclipse's leash. The dog whined, resisting. Dwayne bent forward and kissed his snout. I love you, he murmured. Always. Eclipse was led out, casting one last glance backward. The door closed, and Dwayne turned to face Reverend Morris, tears still drying on his cheeks. Outside in the corridor, Helen leaned against the cold wall, arms wrapped around herself. She had no idea that down another hall, Anton Delocroix was moving. Fast, his phone in hand, new evidence burning a hole in his conscience. But that was a story not yet told. For now, all she could do was wait and pray. Anton Delocroix had never felt time move so fast and so slow all at once. The former detective stood in the shadows of his modest bedroom, bathed in the dim grey light of early morning, tying his weathered dress shoes with shaking hands. The past few hours had been a blur of late-night files, hushed phone calls, and a familiar regret clawing at the edges of his resolve. On the dresser sat a manila folder thick with old notes and fresh printouts. 5 years ago, he had led the investigation that convicted Dwayne Johnson. 5 years ago, he had thought he was doing the right thing. But now, with minutes ticking toward an execution he could no longer justify, Anton was facing a moral reckoning. He had postponed for far too long. The doubts hadn't come all at once. They had crept in like mildew, slow and invasive, especially after his former partner had confessed something over drinks 2 years back. That the fingerprint evidence had never truly been vetted, that the timeline never quite added up, that some testimony had sounded coached. Anton had dismissed it then, telling himself it was just the weight of retirement looming, the nostalgia of a career near its end. But the doubt festered, and when he finally started digging, what he found shattered the confidence he'd once worn like armor. He slipped his phone into his pocket, grabbed the manila folder and checked his watch. 7:20 a.m., less than 2 hours, until Dwayne's scheduled execution. He pulled out a burner phone purchased months ago in case he ever decided to pursue this path, and dialed a number he had memorized but never used until today. It rang 3 times before a voice picked up low and rough. "Yeah, it's Delocqua," Anton said, already stepping into his car. "I need everything you can find on the digital activity of Raymond Concade the week he died, especially banking transactions, any links to shell companies, anything that didn't make it into the original file." "That's a tall order." "I know," Anton cut in. "You have an hour." He ended the call and gripped the wheel tightly. The sky was overcast, casting Redwood City in hues of concrete and fog. Traffic was light, and he made it across town in record time, parking near the courthouse library, which he knew offered public Wi-Fi that extended into the parking lot. Pulling out his laptop, Anton uploaded the documents to his contact and waited. Every minute was excruciating. He replayed the night of the arrest in his head. Dwayne had been calm, insistent. Not the bravado of a killer, but the steady denial of a man who truly believed someone would listen. Anton hadn't. He had been too focused on the profile, too pressured by the politics of a high-profile case. Concade had been untouchable, a real estate magnate with friends in every corner of city power. His murder had shocked the public. They wanted a scapegoat. Dwayne had been a perfect fit. 20 minutes later, his burner buzzed. A text. "Received. Working. Will update soon." Anton pulled out of the lot, heading toward the district courthouse. He was running on adrenaline and caffeine, but he knew exactly what he had to do. If anything in those files pointed to a larger conspiracy, to money being moved, evidence being buried, or worse, a hired killer, he would take it straight to the warden. His phone buzzed again before he reached the building. Another message. Concade's account moved large funds to shell corporations in the week before his death. Money possibly linked to known fixer Walton Green. Green disappeared weeks after the trial. Anton's grip on the wheel tightened. Walton Green. That name had surfaced briefly during the original investigation, but it had been dismissed. No known connection. No reason to pursue. Now it might be the linchpin. He parked illegally, grabbing the folder and his phone as he ran through the courthouse doors. Security guards shouted after him, but he ignored them. He wasn't going to let a metal detector slow him down. He reached the administrative wing and demanded to speak with Warden Batista. She met him in a small office filled with case files and stale coffee. Her expression was tight, eyes flicking from Anton's face to the folder he carried. "You have information that affects the execution?" she asked. "Yes," Anton said. "You need to call the governor's council and request a stay. We have credible evidence that suggests Dwayne Johnson was framed. Money moved through shell accounts. A known fixer, possibly hired to kill Concade, was in town that night. The man has vanished." Batista stared at him, skeptical. "This isn't procedure." "Neither is executing an innocent man," Anton snapped. He laid the folder on her desk and slid it toward her. "Check the phone logs, look at the financial traces. He didn't do this." Her jaw clenched. She opened the folder and scanned the contents. The more she read, the more her posture shifted from dismissive to disturbed. Finally, she picked up the phone and dialed. "This is Warden Batista. I have new information from a credible former lead investigator. We need to delay the execution." Anton stepped back, heart pounding. He didn't know if this would be enough. But for the first time in 5 years, he had done what he should have done from the start. He fought for the truth. The minutes ticked on. Outside, clouds began to break, letting in a fractured beam of sunlight. There was still hope, but it would depend on what happened in the next hour. Warden Mara Batista hung up the phone, her face pale and her grip on the receiver tight enough to blanch her knuckles. She looked up at Anton Delocqua, standing across the desk like a statue of guilt and urgency. The governor's legal counsel will consider a 2-hour stay if we can produce credible supporting data within the next few minutes, she said, her voice a brittle mixture of pressure and disbelief. Anton nodded and immediately began forwarding the contents of his contact's findings. File after file of digital bank records, shell company transactions, and burner phone logs tied to a man named Walton Green. Each document screamed conspiracy, a map of wealth and silence drawn in encrypted messages and redirected payments. Batista stayed on the line with the governor's liaison, narrating details as Anton's files poured in. Helen Griggs stood at the edge of the office, arms crossed tightly, her breath shallow. Every second felt like a tethered balloon about to snap. Then the door opened, and in walked a figure none of them expected. Thomas Jurger, assistant district attorney, and the very man who had prosecuted Dwayne Johnson 5 years earlier, stood in the doorway. He looked thinner than before, his crisp suit wrinkled at the collar. Helen's body tensed like a bowstring, and Anton's jaw clenched. "I heard there are claims of new evidence," Jurger said flatly. "You heard right," Batista replied, not bothering, with pleasantries. "It's significant enough that the governor is considering a stay. We have phone logs, financial trails. We're connecting a known fixer to the victim, Raymond Concade." Jurger raised an eyebrow, but didn't step back. Instead, he moved forward, reading the top file Anton had placed on the desk. Walton Green. He was dismissed early in the investigation. "No direct ties. You were given sanitized information," Anton snapped. "I wasn't. We have digital proof Green was within a mile of Concade's penthouse the night of the murder, and he vanished right after the conviction." Helen stepped in then, her voice sharp with restrained rage. "Why are you even here? Shouldn't you be issuing a public apology instead of acting like this is a strategy meeting?" Jurger glanced at her. For a flicker of a second, there was something behind his eyes that might have been remorse, or perhaps fear. "Because if an innocent man dies on my record, I want to make sure we did everything to prevent it, even at the last second." A tense silence followed, broken only by the rapid clack of Batista's keyboard. Then the office phone rang again. She picked it up, listened, and spoke 3 words that changed everything. 2-hour postponement granted. Helen's legs buckled slightly. Anton caught her elbow as she whispered, "He's not going to die." "Not today." Batista hung up and stood slowly. "We have 2 hours to prove that Walton Green wasn't just in the vicinity, but was involved. We need hard evidence. Bank transfers tied directly to the shell companies, calls made to or from Green's, phone that indicate coordination. If we can't connect the dots, this execution will resume at 11. Anton looked down at his phone and texted furiously, "My contact's still working. We might get the transfers." Jurger rubbed his temples. If those transfers exist, and if Green's presence can be tied to the crime, then the entire conviction collapses. "I'll have to report that to the DA." Batista didn't look away from her screen. "Do it, but right now, help us build the case." For the next 40 minutes, the room was a controlled storm. Files printed, messages exchanged, and every possible legal thread was tugged. A second phone buzzed. Anton grabbed it and read aloud. Green made multiple calls to a number registered to a business associate of Concade. Same night, less than an hour before time of death. That's direct coordination. Helen clutched her chest. That's it. That's enough to raise doubt. Batista stood, grabbing the phone again. This time, her call to the governor's office was shorter. When she turned back to the room, her eyes met Helen's. "They'll honor the stay and open a full investigation. Johnson is not to be executed today." Anton exhaled for what felt like the first time all morning. Jurger looked down, avoiding everyone's eyes. Helen began to cry, soundlessly at first, then in ragged sobs as she dropped into the nearest chair. Outside the administrative wing, a guard passed word down the corridor toward the secure wing. The chain of communication reached a deputy who approached Dwayne Johnson's cell. He opened the door slowly, finding Dwayne still seated, Reverend Morris at his side. "Mr. Johnson," the guard said, and even his voice held a crack of emotion. "Your execution has been stayed. 2 hours for now. A full review is underway. You're not dying today." Dwayne blinked. For a moment, he didn't move. His body, conditioned to years of disappointment, didn't trust what he'd just heard. But then, slowly, his shoulders shook, and he put a hand over his mouth. Morris put a hand on his back. "Thank God," the chaplain whispered. "Am I dreaming?" Dwayne murmured. "No," said the guard. "Not today." Back in the office, Batista was already drafting new orders. She looked at Anton and Helen. "Let's tell him." In person, together they walked the long hallway back toward Dwayne's cell. The air felt different now, tense but electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Not the end. Not yet. But the start of something they could fight for, and for the first time in 5 years, hope didn't feel like a cruel illusion. It felt real. Dwayne Johnson paced the narrow confines of his cell, like a man who had been jolted back from the edge of a cliff, not quite believing he still stood on solid ground. The ticking of the clock on the wall now felt less like a countdown to death, and more like a drumbeat of suspense. Every minute that passed was a stolen breath, a borrowed second. Reverend Morris sat quietly on the corner of the bunk, a silent witness to Dwayne's restless energy, his eyes filled with cautious hope. The cell hadn't changed. The cold, sterile walls still hummed with fluorescent buzz, and the air still smelled faintly of bleach. But everything felt different. Then came a soft knock at the door. It opened, and in stepped Warden Batista, followed closely by Helen Griggs and Anton Delocroix. Dwayne froze. He hadn't seen the detective in 5 years, not since the trial. The sight of him brought a rush of heat to Dwayne's chest, but something in Anton's expression stopped the anger before it could boil. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only guilt and urgency. Batista spoke first, her voice measured but not cold. "Mr. Johnson, the governor has officially granted a 48-hour stay of execution. Based on new evidence uncovered by Detective Delocroix and others, there is now a formal investigation underway." Dwayne blinked. "So they're not today," Anton said, stepping forward, "and maybe not ever." Helen crossed the room quickly and threw her arms around him, and for the second time that morning, Dwayne felt like the world had tilted in his favor. She was crying, and he held her tightly, his chains clinking softly between them. Eclipse wasn't there, but Dwayne could still feel the warmth of the dog's fur on his skin, still hear the soft thump of his tail. When Helen stepped back, Dwayne turned to Anton. "Why now? Why come forward after all these years?" Anton didn't flinch. "Because I finally stopped lying to myself. I knew there were cracks in the case. I should have acted sooner. I'm sorry, Dwayne, I really am. But I swear to you, I will not stop until we clear your name." Dwayne studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "You bring the truth. That's all I ever asked." Batista gave them space, stepping aside to answer a buzzing phone. She returned moments later with a clipped report. That was the governor's legal team. They're reviewing everything. But they want more. A direct link between Walton Green and Concade's death. We have the phone pings. We have the financial trails. But they want something irrefutable. Video, eyewitness, GPS, anything that nails Green to the scene. "We have until tomorrow morning to find it," Anton nodded. "My contact is still digging. We'll find it." Helen touched Dwayne's hand again. "Whatever happens, we bought you time. And we're not letting this slip away." After a few more quiet moments, the group left the cell. Dwayne sat on the bunk, breathing hard, overwhelmed by a hope that scared him more than death had. Hope was dangerous. It came with the risk of being ripped away. Meanwhile, in a low-rise office across town, Anton's contact, an off-the-books cyber expert named Marla, sat hunched over 3 monitors. Her fingers danced across the keys as she decrypted hidden Metadata buried in Concade's server backups. Suddenly, she found something. Security camera logs from a building across the street from Concade's penthouse, long thought erased. A blurry figure, time-stamped. Midnight. The exact moment of the crime. She zoomed in. The figure's build matched green. She froze the frame. A reflective patch on his jacket caught the camera's eye. It was an emblem from a security firm known to work with Concade's competitors. Marla snapped a screenshot and fired it off to Anton with one line. "Found him!" Back at the prison, Anton's phone buzzed. He read the message, eyes widening. He turned to Helen, who stood outside Dwayne's cell, still holding her breath. "We got something. A security cam caught green outside Concade's building. Timestamp. Matches. And the jacket, that patch links him to a firm hired by a rival developer Concade sued 3 weeks before he died." Helen's hand flew to her mouth. "That's motive. That's presence. That's a connection." Anton was already dialing Batista. When she picked up, he didn't wait. "We have video. It shows green near the scene, time-stamped, wearing a jacket. From a firm Concade had litigation with. This isn't just reasonable doubt. This is a viable suspect." Batista responded fast. "Send it. I'll forward it to the Governor's Council and the DA's office." Within minutes, the image was in the inbox of every key player. A few even replied immediately. One word kept repeating, credible. As night fell over Redwood City, the prison lights stayed on. But inside Dwayne's cell, it felt a little less like a cage. Reverend Morris returned to say a quiet prayer with him. Dwayne listened, head bowed, but his mind was on Helen, on Eclipse, on the faint hope that tomorrow might bring freedom. In a quiet house across town, Helen sat with Eclipse curled beside her on the couch. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She kept refreshing her phone, waiting for more updates. The news was already leaking online. Mass Dwayne Johnson trended alongside words like wrongful conviction and justice. The tide was shifting, and for once, it was in their favor. Morning came with a pale golden light that spilled across Redwood City like a reluctant promise. Dwayne Johnson, for the first time in years, woke up not with dread, but with the faint sensation of anticipation curling through his chest. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was something. At 6 a.m., a guard named Tuttle approached his cell with a surprising tone of respect. "Mr. Johnson," he said quietly, as if not to disturb the fragile stillness in the air. "You're being transferred. Pre-release holding, pending a hearing." Dwayne sat up slowly, eyes narrowing. "Pre-release? Why?" "Judge Alvarez called for an emergency session," Tuttle replied. "They want to hear the evidence in full." The phrase felt like a lifeline. Thrown across a chasm, Dwayne stood, his legs a little shaky but steady enough. As he was cuffed and escorted to the transport van, he kept replaying the night before. The video footage, the emblem on Walton Green's jacket, Helen's voice whispering, "We're close." Across town, Helen was already waiting outside the courthouse Eclipse, sitting calmly in the back seat of her truck. She hadn't slept, but the adrenaline masked her exhaustion. She spotted Anton Delocqua pacing near the courthouse steps, phone pressed to his ear. His face was grim, but focused. "They've got the footage," he said when she approached, "and financial records tracing money from one of Concade's shell companies to Green's offshore account. The DA's office reviewed it all last night. If the judge sees what we've seen, this could end today." Helen nodded, her chest tightening. "And if it doesn't?" Anton's eyes softened, his voice dropping. "Then we keep fighting. But he won't be going back to death row. That much I can promise." At 9 a.m. sharp, the courtroom opened. Dwayne was brought in through a side door, dressed not in prison orange, but in a plain grey shirt and slacks. No shackles, just a man the system had tried to bury. Helen's breath caught when she saw him. She stood. He saw her and offered. A small, grateful smile. Judge Alvarez entered the room with a solemn expression. "We are here under extraordinary circumstances," he began. "The conviction of Dwayne Johnson is now under serious scrutiny. Mr. Georgia, I understand you prosecuted this case." Thomas Georgia stood slowly, his face pale, his tone subdued. "Yes, Your Honor, and the state acknowledges new evidence that undermines the original conviction. We no longer oppose the motion to vacate the sentence." A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge turned to Dwayne's new defense attorney, a young but sharp public defender named Martin Boucher. "Mr. Boucher, do you have a motion?" "Yes, Your Honor. We move to immediately vacate the conviction and release Mr. Johnson on his own recognizance, pending any further proceedings." Alvarez leaned back, considering. Then his gaze moved to the file in front of him. "The court has reviewed the evidence, phone logs, financial transfers, security footage, all pointing to an alternate suspect, Walton Green, and a conspiracy far larger than this courtroom. The original conviction no longer holds." He lifted his gavel. Motion granted. "Dwayne Johnson, you are free." The sound of the gavel was like thunder. Helen cried out, rushing forward. Dwayne didn't hesitate. He met her halfway, arms wrapping around her. The courtroom exploded with emotion. Reporters in the back scrambled to capture the moment. Even Judge Alvarez allowed a flicker of a smile. Delacroix stood to the side, his hands clenched, eyes shimmering. A quiet redemption for the man who once helped put an innocent man on death row. Later, outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Helen and Dwayne stepped into the sunlight. She held his hand like it was a lifeline, and Eclipse bounded from the truck, tail wagging uncontrollably. The dog leapt up, paws on Dwayne's chest, licking his chin. Dwayne laughed, an open, unguarded sound that no one had heard in years. Reporters shouted questions, but they didn't answer. Not yet. They wanted one thing: to go home. In the truck, Dwayne stared out the window at a city that looked the same but felt entirely new. Helen reached over, placed her hand on his knee. He looked at her. "I don't know how to live out here anymore," he said quietly. She squeezed his leg. "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time." Behind them, the city buzzed with news alerts and social media updates. Justice for Dwayne trended across platforms. Activists called for inquiries. Politicians issued cautious statements. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was the road ahead, the warmth of the sun on his face, the loyal weight of a dog at his side, and the woman who never stopped fighting for the truth. Dwayne Johnson was no longer a prisoner. He was a survivor, and this was the first day of the rest of his life. Dwayne Johnson stood at the edge of Redwood Creek, morning mist curling around his feet, watching the water ripple like time unspooling. Eclipse sat beside him, panting quietly, ears twitching at every bird call. Behind them, Helen waited with a thermos of coffee and 2 paper cups, her hair pulled into a loose bun, the early sun catching flecks of grey that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Dwayne didn't care. To him, she was unchanged, the one, constant in a world that had crumbled and tried to rebuild itself without him. The city was still reeling. Investigations into Raymond Concade's network had revealed more corruption than anyone expected. Walton Green, now in custody, had confessed under pressure, laying out the chain of bribes and backdoor deals that led to Concade's murder and Dwayne's wrongful conviction. 3 city officials resigned. 2 were indicted. Even Thomas Georgia gave a public statement of apology, admitting that his rush to conviction had been politically driven. Dwayne watched the current drag leaves downstream. He breathed slowly. 5 years, 5 birthdays missed, 5 Christmases locked behind concrete walls, friends lost, a career destroyed. But today he was free, not just legally, but emotionally. The vindication had come with more than a signature. On a court order, It came in the faces of the people who had once judged him, now shifting with guilt. It came in the protests calling for justice reform, and in the strangers who stopped him in the street to say, "We were wrong." Behind him, Helen walked closer, handing him a cup. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, taking a sip. "I will be." They walked in silence, following the winding trail that used to be their favorite before everything fell apart. Eclipse trotted. Ahead, tail wagging, tongue lolling, a dog who had waited 5 years and never once forgotten who his human was. After a few minutes, Helen spoke again. "I heard the compensation board approved the settlement." Dwayne shook his head, not bitter, just tired. "No amount of money can fix it, but maybe it can help us start over. I was thinking," he paused, "maybe we use it to help others. Start something for the wrongfully convicted, a non-profit, legal aid, something real." Helen smiled. "That sounds like the man I remember." They paused at a bench overlooking the creek. Dwayne sat. Eclipse curled at his feet. Helen joined him. He looked at her. "I want to build a life again. Not just survive, live. With you. If you still want that." Her response was quiet, but unwavering. "Always." The breeze stirred the water. A few ducks paddled near the opposite bank. Somewhere distant, a child laughed. Life had continued in his absence. Now it was his turn to reclaim it. Back in the city, the press buzzed with updates. Dwayne Johnson's name had become a symbol, not just of injustice, but of resilience. He was invited to speak at forums, to join committees, to give interviews. But he turned most of them down. He needed time, space, a quiet breath before he carried the weight again. That afternoon, he sat in a modest office with Helen and Anton Deloqua, now working as an advisor for a newly formed state commission on wrongful convictions. Files spread before them. Names, dates, photos of people still trapped where Dwayne had been. Anton looked up. "You ready for this?" Dwayne didn't hesitate. "Let's get to work." He wasn't done. The fight had changed, but it was far from over. Weeks passed. Eclipse became a regular sight at community events, lounging at Dwayne's feet while he spoke softly to reporters or stood quietly among families of the incarcerated. Children loved the dog. Adults recognized the bond as something unbreakable. One evening, Helen found Dwayne on the porch, watching the stars. She sat beside him. "Remember when we used to dream about a house like this?" she asked. He chuckled. "Yeah, I always pictured it with a swing out front." "Well," she said, elbowing him, "now you've got the porch. Maybe the swing comes next." He leaned back. "We lost a lot, but we still have time." Helen nodded. Time and a mission. And that was true, because what began with a final request to see a dog had become something more, a story of defiance, of enduring love, of a system failing but a soul refusing to break. Dwayne Johnson was never meant to be forgotten. He was meant to be remembered as proof that truth matters, that loyalty saves lives, that even at the edge of death, hope can claw its way back, and in the quiet hum of the creek, the whisper of wind through trees, and the steady beat of a dog's heart, that hope lived on. They had made it. Together, he was caged, forgotten. Minutes from death, but a dog's loyalty, a woman's love, and a stranger's conscience pulled him back from the edge. Dwayne Johnson isn't just a name anymore. He's a symbol, a living reminder that justice, when denied, demands louder voices, and that sometimes the loudest voice comes from a silent dog waiting by the door. If this story moved you, if it made you cry, made you hope, made you feel, then don't let it end here, like this video. Comment below, what would you fight for if the world turned its back on you? Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances, because sometimes all it takes is one story to change everything.